Welcome to China Dispatches, the official podcast of the European Union Chamber of Commerce in China. This is Jacob Gunter, the Chamber's Senior Policy and Communications Manager. This episode is a recording of our Summer 2020 VIP webinar series, which featured government, business, and thought leaders from around the world having frank discussions on tough topics with Chamber President Joerg Wuttke. If you're tired of long speeches and looking for lots of back and forth, you've come to the right place. If you enjoy the conversation, have a look at our website and sign up for future webinars so you can enjoy them live and even ask questions of our speakers. Without further ado, let's jump right into the topic. Peak globalization.
Ladies and gentlemen, members, friends across Europe, definitely China, and I hope some in other parts of Asia and the United States. It's a privilege to now invite you to our birthday party. The Chamber has now turned 20, and we had deliberately chosen 8 events in China. It has to be the number 8. In order to celebrate this with lots of friends, and definitely the highlight today is 3 distinguished panelists that have been covering China from different angles. Of course, first of all, Mrs. Charlene Barshefsky, Mrs. WTO, who was negotiating the accession of China into WTO 2000 and 2001. Then we have Jyrki Katainen, who was in the commission until recently in November, and he was Mr. China in the commission. He was our point man in order to negotiate, among other things, the investment agreement. And then I'm very happy to have Mikuláš Dzurinda with me, Prime Minister of Slovakia until 2006. And particularly, I was very keen to have someone who actually has his boots in 2 areas in the European Union as well as NATO, as he brought Slovakia into both organizations. And I basically want to get also his feel about where's Europe and where's the NATO and where's the US heading, and what is China going to do to us in this comparison. So I'm very happy that we start with a couple of questions, but first of all, we expect you members to chip in questions because I'm sure they're more intelligent than mine. And so I would say that we have about 30-40 minutes about talking among the 4 of us. I hope just 3 of us, so not me. And then Jacob, he's my chief censor, will look into your questions. And if they are better than mine, he will chip them in and stop me and throw them at our panel. So with all this, let's start because we are 20 years old. We were founded in 2000 because Pascal Lamy, who was Charlene's counterpart at that time, felt it didn't make sense to talk to the German, Spanish, French chamber. He wanted to talk to business in categories such as, in my case, petrochemicals, lawyers, and so forth. And that was an inspiration to us to found the chamber 20 years ago. So in that period of time of hope and looking forward, Charlene, we were founded. You were the one bringing China into the WTO. So looking back, maybe you can share 1 or 2 stories that you haven't shared yet. And of course, maybe just mention about the key figure in this game, Zhu Rongji. And of course, then, as you said in Hong Kong recently, that China deviated from its commitments, and we are partly in the mess that we are in because of the fact that actually China felt like they don't have to follow the WTO accession by letter and by the spirit. So Charlene, tell us, how was it in those days?
Well, first of all, Jörg, thank you so much for having me, and happy birthday, excuse me, to the Chamber. When I think about those days, I actually think about the contrast between then and now. So that if you think about China's reform and opening from Deng Xiaoping forward through WTO accession, that period was highly productive for China. China was beginning to move toward Western notions of openness. And of course, that was capped by the commitments China made with respect to WTO. And then I look at today, of course, there's been an absence essentially of reform and opening since roughly 2006 or 2007. This is now, 12 years later. And other than a couple of things here and there, there's been virtually no progress with respect to the further opening of China's market. And of course, that's one of the reasons there is such enormous friction between the US and China. And then when I think about the time of WTO, particularly Zhu Rongji, you think of the boldness of the vision that China had then and the degree of risk it was actually taking. I don't know of any country that ever went upside down because of joining the WTO, but China was always a bit different. The scale is entirely different, and its experience with reform on a very deep, very broad basis was lacking. So Zhu Rongji, being a very brilliant guy, but also a calculated risk taker, took the risk and pushed the Chinese system in that direction. To me. And then you look at the present time, and after 2.5 years of knockdown, drag out tariffs and counter tariffs and retaliatory tariffs and all of the rest that's been going on. And what do we have? A phase 1 trade deal, which is entirely tepid and whose purchase goals in any event, as though that should be the subject of a trade agreement, which it should not, but the purchase goals themselves were always a bit pie in the sky. So you have this boldness of this earlier period and of the leadership then contrasted with this itty-bitty, rather small arrangement, really designed to just get by on China's part, just enough to mollify the United States. And last, when I think about the time then, and I think about the degree of engagement with China, the number of meetings, the number of trips, not for just me, but the entire cabinet was really involved in China policy, in coming to learn and know about China in a rather deep way for political appointees, to be frank. And then you look at today, and there's essentially no engagement. There's been some on trade, obviously, largely by necessity on the part of China, but there's been virtually no engagement. There's no strategic framework. There's no strategic discussion of any sort. And we see a shallowness to the relationship, which after all of these years is both shocking and disappointing.
Yeah. Well, Charlene, the stars were aligned in the late 90s with having Bill Clinton as president, as well as having Zhu Rongji as prime minister. That was the fortune. How was Bill Clinton's attitude at that time, his eagerness in order to get China into WTO?
Bill Clinton was very interested in China's WTO accession. He's a big thinker and very brilliant with respect to nearly any subject. I wouldn't say eager is the right word. One of the really wonderful things about Bill Clinton, if you were a member of his cabinet, is that he trusted his cabinet. And so he wasn't going to move unless I and others said, this is now the time. So he was both patient, but also very bold. And his vision was really the notion of greater compatibility between the US and China. Not sameness. China was not going to be a democracy. He had no history of that, essentially. But greater consistency, greater compatibility, less friction, more mutuality, greater engagement, all with the notion of reform, economic development, growth for China and for the rest of the world, and stability. As you know, Bill Clinton used to say that worse than a strong China is a weak and unstable China. And that is still true, I think, today, particularly for not just China, but for the region in general.
Jyrki, in your time as Vice President of the Commission and being Mr. China, you were not that lucky like Bill Clinton to have someone to dance with like Zhu Rongji. You possibly had to face a system that was more in kind of zero-sum thinking, so it doesn't want to compromise anything. And you, as a the textbook free trader from Finland, has at the end been part of a paper which labeled China as partner, competitor, as rival. How was that journey possible? And also, how do you see this relationship that we have now is going to impact us in business?
Well, thank you very much. Let me first congratulate European Chamber. I must say that you were a very close partner to me and to my cabinet and to whole commission. And your help and your ideas and your knowledge was really helpful for the European Commission when we designed our China policy, and also individual proposals we made to Chinese counterparts and friends. Indeed, I was not necessarily as lucky as Bill Clinton, but I had very close relationship with Vice Premier Mark Hai and Vice Premier Liu He, and I did respect the way we discussed with each other. It was very open, sometimes very frank, and sorry, my dog is barking.
It's okay if he disagrees.
Yeah. So we had very open and frank discussions with each other, and it helped to understand each other. But I must admit that I got very little done. I was negotiating comprehensive investment agreement with my Chinese counterparts for almost 5 years, and we achieved very little. By the end of the last Commission's term, we saw some movement. Clearly, Chinese wanted to commit themselves to these negotiations more than a few years before. But in terms of concrete achievements, we got very, very little. And I discussed several times with my colleagues and friends in China that the lack of reciprocity is a disease, and it's getting worse and worse in Europe, and I guess also in other countries too. And you have to understand the worth of it, because unless you are not ready to open up your market, it leads to the thinking that you want to misuse or abuse our openness. And now we see the results of this development. So hopefully this COVID-19 break or disruption helps our Chinese friends to reconsider their position, because now more than before, we need open trade environment. We need to rebuild trust. We need to reboot the economy. And even though open market may raise some concerns in Chinese side, it's still worth it. So we cannot afford to maintain this kind of situation where the relationship is unbalanced, because it does not help to develop new technologies. For instance, now one of the major issues is how we create new rules for digital trade, for instance, or digital content. And here we need reciprocity. This is one of the source or one of the area where the concerns are the greatest in different markets today.
Yes, Mikuláš, you are a man who took sides because you brought Slovakia into the European Union, you brought Slovakia into NATO. There was a clear commitment in order to anchor Slovakia in the Western world. Now, China is going global and actually also wants countries to take sides. You know, are you with us or are you against us? And one of these mechanisms seems to be that it's 17+1, where basically they sort of cherry-picked a couple of countries, including your own, in order to then discuss with China. So how do you see this dance that Europe has to do between the US and China, and where do you see is our space there?
Thank you very much, Jörg, for being invited. And I'd like at the beginning to join my colleagues and friends to congratulate you to this round anniversary, wishing all the best for the next 2 decades and even more. And and maybe the second footnote. Well, listening to Charlene and Jurki, I realized that in time of the turn of the millennium, when China was struggling for WTO membership, at the same time I was struggling for NATO and EU membership. So we did more or less the same business. And now, and now to your question. As a man of huge optimism, I am a bit skeptical when it comes to 17+1 idea or so-called project. Why? Because first of all, I am a man of economic effectiveness. My basic origin is the departure of the train, the manager on the station, railway station. So I like things tangible, economically transparent, and effective. And by the way, I had been studying one of particular projects. It was a railway connection of the broad gauge from the Far East to Vienna via Russia, Ukraine, and Slovakia. It cannot work between us. So the more I studied about Belt and Road Initiative or 17+1 ideas, the more I realized that it was much more geopolitical issue than the project of infrastructure or connectivity or something like that. So my skepticism is based on this concrete experience and with many discussions with friends from different countries. The second reason why I am a bit skeptical is Chinese political behavior. Allow me to be frank and open, especially today when I follow the situation in Beijing, and we all know that the Chinese parliament has adopted very recently the national security law on Hong Kong. This is not good news. But also when it comes to our region, or the EU, as Jurki has emphasized, the political behavior is not good. When it comes to trade, asymmetry, and we all know that we need to level the playing field. We need China to be more open. You know these things much better than I, but this is clear that it cannot work if the political behavior based on assertiveness or even more on aggressiveness, unwillingness for reciprocal economic approach, it cannot work. Last but not least, why I'm skeptical is the pandemic. There is something like a natural shift of our priorities. Maybe infrastructure projects were more attractive 15 years ago than in these days. We all know that in these days, we need to invest much more in the healthcare. We need to invest much more to economic recovery, to restructuralization of our industry, to future technologies at the helm with artificial intelligence, and last but not least, to the environment. So this natural shift of priorities also determines my skepticism when it comes to 17+1 initiative.
Yeah. Well, Mikolash, we in the Chamber published a paper on Belt and Road in January, and basically it is a spoken hub model. It has no multilateral features. It's us, China, with many, many, many countries. And we found, frankly, a bit shocking the result, how little business comes out of this scheme. But Charlene, what do you, I mean, this kind of choosing, the US at its present administration is very often leaning on Europe in order, you know, you have to be with us and so forth. And it's of course very difficult if you see that you get hammered by trade tariffs and by decisions such as gas pipelines and so forth. But I mean, all of this, is there anything left between the US and Europe in order to find common ground? Is there something that you can see that Lighthizer and Phil Hogan might find common ground in order to come up with something? And how much would be China, what would be China's role there as an instigator, meaning because of China we do this, or how much would you envisage that we can actually include China in this process?
Well, it's a very complicated question. Let me say, first of all, that I agree very much with the statements that Jyrki and Mikuláš have said. And there's no question, there's no reciprocity in the relationship. China has become economically extremely aggressive, bullying Australia for wanting an investigation of COVID is but one example, and shows that China is trying to export not only its economic model to some extent, but also trying to export its more repressive policies abroad. There are many other things one could say about what China is doing, including geopolitically. From the point of view of the US and Europe, I think we have to be honest, right? So democratic systems and the autocratic, far more repressive system that China has don't mix very well. There is very limited commonality, other than, in general, a desire on the part of politicians everywhere to see poverty lessen and to see that basic need is met. But other than that, which is a big thing, okay, maybe that's a start, there is very little commonality. China is hammering home the notion that its system is superior to a democratic system, not only for its domestic population, but also as it expands its sphere of influence through Belt and Road, which has always been an important component of what Belt and Road is. For Europe, for the US, for Japan, Australia, Korea, for the countries that are NATO allies, for the countries that have democratic systems, I think it's extremely important that these countries understand that they need to stick together when it comes to a values-based approach to governing and to international relations. The attractiveness of a democratic model, not to autocratic rulers, but to people, I believe remains. And it's for the US and Europe together, because one cannot do it alone, for the US and Europe together to lead a broader coalition to ensure that nations aren't left with choosing something because there's no alternative, but in fact that nations are in a position to guide their own countries in a way that is more compatible and more consistent with democratic norms. The idea here isn't to exclude China in the sense of an affirmative exclusion. It is simply the reality that China is operating on a basis very different from a democratic basis, and that democracies tend to like their system better, as China likes its system apparently better. Those are not small differences, and we must act to preserve what makes democracy such an extraordinary form of government.
Jyrki, while you were vice president, your colleague Cecilia Malmström, also she talked about this last week here, actually was reaching out to Buenos Aires to have a common understanding with Bob Lighthizer and her Japanese colleague in order to find common ground. While you were in office at that time, did you see some realistic hope that this could do? And is the hope still there, or is it fading away?
Well, the three markets, Japan, the United States, and the EU, wanted to team up in order to to revitalize multilateralism. And as we know, during the last couple of years, it has not been the favorite topic in the United States side neither. So that's why our trilateral work was not that effective. But still, I believe that is the only way forward, because like Charlene said, the democracies, those who believe in the liberties of normal people and the free market, supposed to be the drivers of multilateralism. So now, for instance, when looking at WTO, it's in very difficult situation due to the lack of appellate body, and the Commission has proposed some sort of arbitration scheme for getting trade disputes solved, because there are always some disputes, and there is growing momentum in this subject at the moment, and we do hope in the European side that our member states, but also the others, would look at the new opportunities to replace WTO temporarily. Of course, it would be better if WTO would be stronger and it could solve disputes if there are ones. So one common nominator which united us, three of us, was the future or the topic of how to regulate the digital world, because this is an area of business where the trust is of utmost importance. So we cannot imagine well-functioning digital trade, or trade generally speaking, because part of it is always digital, unless we have transparent, well-functioning global rules. And I believe that the three markets could agree on principles of that, and then it would be open for China too. Of course, China is always welcome to join this discussion if they wish so, but up until now, we haven't seen any serious signals on that.
Yeah. I mean, digital is a good thing to point out. In January, Bertelsmann Foundation in Berlin came out with a survey, and I think it was with Pew Research together, and it shows that the European community of people, just 6% believe and can trust Chinese high-tech or digital services, 20% US, and then of course very high confidence in European equipment and services. Mikolas, when you look at this kind of thing, where do you see Europe venturing? Is that we find our own way in all of this? Do we have to take sides? And is the Chinese soft power something that unites us or divides us?
China is trying, by my mind and by my observation and understanding, is trying to divide us. A classical divide et impera, or divide and rule tactics, nothing new. I have some experience from time of communism because I spent half of my life under the Soviet dictatorship, nothing new. This is one, or the first remark. The second remark is crucial, or your first remark is crucial. Should we side to US or China? My choice is very clear, even though I don't like to fall into trap to judge China black or white. I know that people sometimes are different than the leaders. And I can imagine that there is also a strong, silent opposition in China. We know about that. But when it comes to the future, I'm sure that the future is only in a strong US-EU alliance. And the key lies on our European side. Trump is Trump, but the future of the US is not Mr. Trump only. I have fantastic memories of Bill Clinton, but also both Bushes, completely different people. So the key lies on our European side. What does it mean? it means reform. We need a lot of reforms to be stronger, not only when it comes to soft power, but also when it comes to hard power, technologies, to become really reliable ally, not partner, ally to the United States. This is the case. I strongly believe that Chinese leaders do not understand weak partners, but I strongly believe that they understand strong partners like Mr. Putin, whom I know so well. So the future belongs to the West, I am pretty sure, even though we face a lot of internal difficulties inside of the EU. It is true, there is a lot of dividing lines. It is true that there is a big misunderstanding how to spend money now for economic recovery, whether much more money for grants or for loans, but it is very, very natural to have a different opinion. I will be very frank and open and brief. I believe in authentic European federation based on strong or strongest subsidiarity principle. And being strong, we will be treated also differently in Washington, and together with Washington, differently in Beijing. This is my vision very briefly.
No, it's a wonderful vision, really. Charlene, what Mikoslav is saying is there must be Joe Biden in office very soon. Will he change the equation with Europe?
Look, let me re-emphasize something that Mikolas has said. When we think about China policy and when we think about the United States, imagine for a moment if Xi Jinping was not president of China. Imagine for a moment if Donald Trump were president of the United States. So we have to think not only about the present and how we deal with the reality with which we're faced. Xi Jinping is obviously president for life. Donald Trump will do everything he can to hold on to office. But we also have to look ahead and recognize that there are foundations and habits that we can create now, which will only strengthen us regardless who is in office. So with respect to the US and Europe alliance, it's been frayed, but the last thing the US would want to see is a Europe disintermediated by China or Russia, which is what's happening, as we know. That will simply weaken Europe internally. It will weaken Europe as a partner, and that's extremely dangerous for the United States because the US operates on the basis of an alliance structure, on the basis of shared responsibility, but also on the basis of greater compatibility of interests, even among countries that aren't long-standing democracies, but that are willing on a more reciprocal basis to deal with democratic governments than China is, for example, now. So I think that we have a lot of work that would have to be done between the US and Europe. There is always frustration with European decision-making, for example, on the part of the United States because of the cumbersome process that you have. When I was USTR, to be frank, it used to drive me entirely crazy. But there is no substitute for Europe. And this, I think, any thinking person understands full well. And of course, from Europe's side, the US makes it crazy, right? We bully, we think we're the big shots, and we don't take into account sensitivities and sensibilities of a more Europeanist mindset, and we should. So, we're married. We've had rough spots, but the key is that we are married, and the strength of each depends on the strength of the other. And until policymakers and perhaps the new president appreciates that, we simply ourselves have to build for a much better future.
I'm sure, Jyrki, that not in your administration, there was a frustrating, cumbersome decision-making process. So possibly you can't really relate to what Charlie was saying, but you know, you are a blue-blooded European, and it is interesting to see that the COVID challenge that Europe is facing somehow has first divided us, but now there seems to be an opportunity for us to unite again. I mean, Macron, Merkel hammered out the Corona, I call it Corona bond, politically totally incorrect. But there it seems to be a more engagement. And last night, Merkel gave a speech where she clearly says that Europe belongs together with the United States and made it a very clear point. So is COVID an opportunity for us to grow together after the initial mishap and challenges that we faced?
Well, I believe very strongly that the EU will further develop after the COVID-19, because if looking at the history, EU has taken the largest steps forward only after or during the crises. And this will happen also this time. So that's why I don't really like those of my former colleagues who are using the language that the COVID is existential crisis to Europe. I don't believe in that. I mean, only if there is no rational left at all in Europe, this could be the case. But if looking at, for instance, what are the things the people and the governments have criticized the EU? They are the lack of action in the areas where EU has not had competence. So basically, if you want to make Europe stronger, to be capable to help its members or address the crises, whatever they are, we need to deepen the integration, and we have to make the EU stronger. The only thing we know for sure is that there are also new crises ahead of us. We just don't know what kind of crises and when they're there, but the new crisis will come anyway. And that's why we need to be better prepared. I'd like to concentrate, for instance, on security cooperation. EU has gone forward quite rapidly during the last 5 years, but still security and defense, also cyber security policies, we need to be capable to defend each other against cyber or different types of hybrid threats. Also, we need better healthcare preparedness, etc. And of course, we need to create new regulatory environment for growing businesses, such as circular economy or climate-based business models, or data economy, digital services, etc. So there are lots of opportunities for making Europe stronger. But one interesting issue I want to raise is what I just recently heard, that now when our member states are vulnerable, economically vulnerable, and to some extent politically also, many of our member states have started to look at foreign investments more careful than before. We established the European investment screening mechanism just a little while ago, and it was quite sensitive politically speaking. There were a number of countries who were not interested in that, and they thought that we should not create or erect obstacles to foreign direct investment. This was never our aim, of course, but the aim of Commission's proposal was to create a mechanism which increases transparency. Who is investing to our member states, and help to analyze for what reasons. And now, during the COVID crisis, many of those countries who were rather critical are now looking at how they could create a national mechanism which could be linked to the European investment screening mechanism. And that's a positive thing. I hope it's not driven by growing protectionist mode, but because of healthy need to be aware who is investing to our countries now when our own economic structures or companies are not as strong as they used to be.
Mikuláš, there's always this talk out there, you know, the virus came out of China, but China was exemplary in dealing with the virus. And the West is in chaos. You know, everyone points at Spain and Italy and so forth, let alone the United States. But as a matter of fact, you're living in a country which possibly has the lowest percentage rate of any cases. And there are cases like Finland, where Jyrki was prime minister, as well as Portugal. There are exceptional cases where countries actually nearly got out of this with 0 cases. So what is it that made that happen for you? Is it just sheer luck? Is it discipline? And does it also show that Europe is partly really able to fight that? And how will COVID change our community back home?
I would say that 7-3, it is the question of our discipline and fortunate. But mostly this is the question of our discipline. You know, we spent many decades under the regime of, you know, of commands. If the prime minister says something, we follow his commands. So this is a part of a positive heritage from the time of oppression or communism. At the very beginning, the former prime minister, even though he's coming from the former communist bloc, had decided immediately to adopt protective measures, and he did right. So this is the one reason. The second reason is our feature or nature of our people. We are not very rebellious. We are not, too numerous or very big. And being small, we need to be clever and to be flexible enough. So this is why we are not so recalcitrant or rebellious. And till now, I am in shock following people on the streets, how they are equipped and protected. So this is the basis of our success. Since the very, very beginning, I was in Estonia, if I am not mistaken, in Tallinn, beginning of March, or 7th of March. In a few days, Slovakia has adopted these measures, and we did well. So this is behind. And how COVID will influence our societies. I, as an eternal optimist, I believe that in a positive way. I follow much higher level of solidarity. You mentioned, Jörg, a while ago, some numbers or the results of opinion polls. The recent polls in the EU show what Jyrki has mentioned recently, that people strongly believe in European cooperation. Especially in time of crisis, we can reunite forces and to look at Brussels not only as on a bubble or bureaucrats, but on the institutions that can work together, being in the European Parliament, in the Commission, in the Council. And I am pretty happy that majority of people now is willing to go together. And I am also especially glad that now this crisis has brought Angela Merkel and French President Macron together. Who would have said 2 years ago that Angela Merkel will call openly for something like European federalization? She's telling in these days that no nation, no single country has the future, only when sticking together. And I strongly believe that COVID-19 has contributed to this understanding and will a lot.
Jörg, may I build on what Mikulas just said about the future? I'm also optimistic that in times like that, when there's a major disruption, we should understand that there is no point to start to return back to so-called normal. So in other terms, to return to February, which was not that normal neither, but nevertheless, because now when there are disruptions in different parts of our society, for instance, in many markets, we should be very careful how to use, for instance, our stimulus measures, because you can use your euro or dollar only once, and it's better to use not only efficiently, but for the way which builds something which is important for the future. For instance, if some country or the EU wants to boost investment, it would be wise to use this money for addressing climate change, or boosting circular economy, or investing in digital connections. So one thing we have been talking a lot about the digital jump or digital leap. I don't know exactly what does it mean in different countries, but one thing is sure, that now we have much better equipped or much better experienced people with the digital services and digital equipments. So this development, which has happened during the last 3 months, would have taken how many years? 7-8 years. So now we have completely new market for digital services, for instance. So that's why we should not hold on, for instance, climate policies or climate targets. Instead, we need to, we should not push back climate policies. Instead, we should invest heavily on climate policy related technologies and businesses, because this crisis is ahead of us anyway.
Could I build on the comments already made, just to say a word about the US and then a word about China? For the United States, COVID, I think, accelerates trends that were already apparent. I also think that happens to be true with respect to China-US relations. But on the US side, the division between Americans, urban, rural, red state, blue state, have become very deep. When you add COVID, what you see is that in the US, 40% of people earning less than $40,000 a year are out of work. They lost their jobs. 40% of people earning $40,000 or less. So, and these, of course, tend to be less well educated. These are people who already were working 2 and 3 jobs to simply make ends meet. These are people, as unfortunately almost a majority of Americans, who don't have more than $400 in the bank in total for any catastrophic event, let alone ordinary medical and other types of care. It's these kinds of divisions that exist in the US with respect to inequality that are, of course, damaging in and of themselves and inexcusable in and of themselves for a country as wealthy as we are, but that also now have become political fodder for people like Trump and others that simply want to deepen those divisions as much as possible. So for the United States, COVID reinforces trends that were already apparent with respect to inequality and so on. And politically, these are becoming quite rooted in the US. Were Joe Biden to be president, he obviously would want to try and reverse this, but it's going to take a lot of work. And if Trump were to win again, I don't even want to think about that. With respect to COVID and the effect on US-China relations, I think COVID exacerbates 3 trends that were already apparent, the third of which is of great concern. First, our attitudes of the American people. 60% of Americans have a negative view of China and view China as a threat, 60%. That is 20 percentage points higher than the day Trump took office. So you can see how eroded this question of trust is. COVID simply exacerbates this because of China's initial handling of the crisis. Second, you already saw before COVID the fissures between the US and China broaden and deepen, right? So it started as a trade conflict, became an investment conflict, became a services conflict and tech conflict became, as we're headed toward now, a potential financial conflict. And each of these conflicts has deepened post-COVID as the US economy now faces 36 million people unemployed in total, and an unemployment rate that some estimate will hit 25% before it goes down. That would be equivalent to the worst in the Great Depression in the United States. And the third trend that was already well in evidence, but it will be very exacerbated by COVID, is decoupling. And that is the shrinking of supply chains, the further exacerbation of a slowdown in trade, which has been the case since the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, and which will further divide the US and China. And of course, COVID, given the focus on medical equipment, I think underscores the fact that countries do need to have redundancy with respect to critical supplies. But medical won't be the only thing, as we know, and the definition of what is needed for security or what is critical can be quite expansive. Anyone who's dealt with China knows how expansive the words critical and security are. The same, alas, will become true in the United States potentially. So I think COVID for the US, just as a country, and then for US-China relations, is a very serious event with potential quite lasting characteristics.
Well, let me ask you the final question, then we open up to the audience, and you're released from my stupid questions. And it's about decoupling. You know, if you look into the kind of small steps, as Charlene, you just pointed out, it starts tariff war, tech war, financial war. It feels like we are not sensible anymore. We are desensitized about the problems, the many red lines that used to be there, and we cross them one by one, frankly, with quite some ease. And then off top, you know, we don't actually realize when Matt Pottinger in the NSC actually congratulates the Taiwanese president for his inauguration, of course, in perfect Chinese. And then at the same time also you have the Chinese foreign minister last Sunday in his press conference coming up again with a word that I think Xi Jinping was telling his files and ranks not to mention, a new Cold War for quite a while. And for the first time, this word pops up again. Chinese politicians don't speak by coincidence about this. So we're crossing red line after red line after red line. Now, in the chamber, Jacob, who's sitting next to me, is our lead pen, and myself and others, we will try to write a report on decoupling. So if any of the three of you have a view on decoupling, or would even give the two of us a suggestion of where we're heading and how we could actually frame that.
Jyrki and Charlene has just spoken, so maybe I will try to answer this question as the first. I have to admit that I don't like this expression decoupling, because by my mind, it is also unrealistic. China is too big and to a large extent also too attractive for our producers. So it would be loss business. I like win-win business or win-loss if I'm the winner. But lose, this is not a clever approach. So this is why I am not a big fan of decoupling. But what I would call for is to reach a level of higher independency, both in the United States and in Europe, or in the West, if you want. And it should be applied especially in business. I don't want to repeat what has already been said by Charlene and Jyrki brilliantly, how to eliminate asymmetry, how to increase mutual reciprocity. But being able to reach such a level, we need to be stronger, less dependent when it comes to medical equipment, when it comes to availability of protective equipment and supplies of medicines, but also when it comes to technologies. I remember very well, only a few years ago, it was very difficult to imagine that we will refuse Huawei 5G systems. In days, it becomes reality that we do, and we will struggle for something else. So the key lies again in an area which has already mentioned by you, to adopt necessary measures, to adopt really, really strong reforms, to become much more stronger and much more closer with the United States. Of course, in relations with the US, not everything is good, but I strongly believe that sooner or later we are back on the right track, mutually doing bilaterally, but also in multilateral fields. I strongly believe in it. And reaching such a level, then I strongly believe that China will listen more carefully than in these days. Let's adopt reforms. Let's make, using the terminology of Mr. Trump, let's make Europe stronger and the West more reliable. But Charlene has said this at the beginning. Let's make the West even more attractive. This is not bad today. All Western Balkan countries want to join the EU. Opinion polls in Ukraine is very clear. For the EU, maybe 75%, and more for NATO than for other security composition. Ukraine, big country, the neighbor of Russia. Why? They are keen on the West, not in Moscow or Beijing. So this is still good, but we need to go farther.
Charlene, you want to chip in, or we start with the questions?
No, I want to rest with what was just said because it was pretty perfect.
May I, Jörg, add one additional point? I very much agree with Mikulas when he says that he doesn't like the word decoupling because the reason he mentioned, the dependency is so strong between the three markets. But one thing which seems to be pretty obvious is that many companies are more keen than before to look at the supply chains. Charlene mentioned this also before. So I wouldn't see, at least this point of time, this as a signal of protectionism, but more as a signal of creating more secure supply chains. This may, to some extent, mean that the European internal supply chains may get stronger, or then the EU-US supply chains may replace some other existing supply chains. But I still believe that the globalization, as we have seen it, will continue, but with slight difference or slight changes in order to make businesses' supply chains more secure. So and there's also a need to create better rules-based economic relationship in the markets which did not exist 10 years ago. For instance, digital services, etc. So now we have new technologies which are present, which didn't exist before, and that's why we need new hopefully global rules for having level playing field and taking into account the privacy type of issues. So basically at the same time when to some extent new supply chains may appear, there is a constant need for better regulated, safer markets for new products and services.
Can I just add one thing? Well, two things. First of all, companies over the last 10 years have looked at supply chains in a way different from the earlier time. Supply chains were becoming too diffuse, too numerous in terms of companies dealt with. Different points of failure could arise because supply chains are supply chains and popular given the fact that they are efficient, meaning no redundancy and just in time. So these are very lean kinds of operations. And so for a number of years, companies have looked to do what companies always do, right? Diversify sources of supply and ameliorate risk, right? So decoupling certainly adds a political gloss, but on something that had already been going on. So for a number of years, companies have had a China plus strategy. It's why Vietnam has grown the way it has, or you see Malaysia, a number of other countries around the world, including in the Western Hemisphere, that have benefited from changes in the way companies view China, changes in the desire with respect to diversification and the amelioration of risk. So the political gloss, decoupling, is not particularly helpful and to some extent belies a process that was already going on among certainly major corporations with supply chains that had become too extensive and too difficult to manage. So I would make that one point. But the second point is this. If you really thought about complete decoupling with China, if you really thought about the implication of that, you would not want it. Because one of the great elements of globalization is that it gives every country a stake in every other country's prosperity and stability when you trade with them, right? Everyone is looking for markets, right? Countries want to increase their productive capacity and their productive output. Domestic economies typically can't absorb what can be produced. And so you hope for the economic health of those to whom you sell, or you aren't making sales. And you hope for political stability among those to whom you wish to sell, or you have no new market. And so if we actually thought about decoupling from China, then we have not only the economic impacts, frankly, on both countries, but we have the foreign policy, the security, and such policies as well, which would become of concern very quickly. For a country like the US and for a country like China, having external constraints on your behavior is a good thing. It is a protective thing. And one of those external constraints is the fact that you are economically tied, or certainly not strangers, right? And those external restraints make you think twice about policy. And that's as true for China still even today as it is for the US or Europe. So seeing supply chains rationalized because that makes sense to do, seeing greater redundancy with respect to critical areas like medical, for example, this should have been done anyway, including, frankly, by government stockpiling. But thinking that actual decoupling makes the US safer or stronger or more prosperous, no. My argument would be that other than taking the kinds of precautions one would take in any event, one risks something far more dire than losing out occasional arguments.
All right, great. We'll jump now to questions from the audience. Our first question comes from Marco Mertonen. It's a question on Russia, which I think will be interesting, as our speakers come from Slovakia, Finland, the US, and Germany, all of which have a contentious history with Russia. So how do you see the Russian economic and political position in the midst of the EU-China-US triangle? And how will the COVID-19 outbreak impact Russia's position within that triangle?
Turkey is closer to Russia, but mentally or coming from the past, I am as well. I speak, by the way, I speak fluently still Russian. When I made Putin nervous, I switched to Russian, to improve my image a bit. Look, I don't want to dramatize, but the situation gets worse and worse in this country. Politically, it seems to me that Mr. President is very tired. You know what is the development when it comes to oil price, on the price of energies. So Russia is in a very, very difficult situation, economically and not good politically. And COVID and its implication, this is an unmitigated disaster in Russia. Having said this, I would like to underline that nobody knows the real figures in this country. So there is a good news or bad news. Good, by my mind, the good news is that the danger of the imperial behavior coming from this country is a bit lesser than in the past. But bad news is that every instability in Russia is also not welcome. So the question is very comprehensive and difficult. Despite the fact that the situation, economic situation, is not good, Russia is playing with fire in European neighborhood. Russia doesn't represent a stable factor, neither when it comes to Ukraine-Russia relations or the Middle East issue. We know that Russia has been very active in Syria. We know that Russian militias operate in Libya in these days. Instead of striving for common regional good, they still want to demonstrate that they are here, even though they are much more regional leader than in the past. So I'm not sure whether Marco from Slovakia is happy with my answer. Visiting Russia since my child age, speaking the language, reading Dostoevsky, loving the Russian culture, I know very well that the Russian people and the nation is not the same, and we should not identify these all people with the current political leadership. I had good relations with Boris Nemtsov, Yegor Gaidar, many other politicians in Russia. And maybe you remember as well that there was a period of time in which we believed, President Bush, I spoke to Bush Jr. several times, that we all believed that the country will follow the way of modernization and will cooperate with us more closely in a way which can be acceptable for both sides. But unfortunately, now we face more kleptocracy than the way towards pluralistic, not speaking democratic society.
Jyrki, before you start, let me just say that the gentleman asking that question is a Finn based in Chongqing. He happens to be my BSF colleague. And he wanted me to say that he's from the region of Savo and the city of Kuopio, and that you possibly also know the godfather for his daughter, Kimmo Timonen. I know Finland is a village, but just before you start.
Good. That's very good. Actually, Kuopio is my region, my constituency, and Kimmo Timonen is the famous ice hockey player. I know him well. So, in economic wise, I don't think Russia has very much to offer to the global economy. And that's a little bit pity, because if the things were differently, they were more connected to the rest of the world. But up until now, they have not done any serious efforts to become more global economic power. On the other hand, on the contrary, actually, the current economic development and discussion in Russia is more inward-looking. But taking into account the current COVID situation, it can become a serious thing also in Russia. As Mikulas said, we don't know exactly the right figures, and it may have some political consequences. Having said this, it's also true that Russian people are quite resilient. They can stand difficult times much better than many other people, or many, for instance, average European. So difficult to assess what kind of consequences COVID may cause in political wise in Russia. But politically speaking, Russia is becoming stronger for sure, as we have seen. They are increasingly meddling to the political processes in various member states, also using charm campaigns, etc., like what we saw happening in Italy in the beginning of this COVID crisis. So they are very capable in that sense, and I would not underestimate the role in the EU member states, but also in the United States and elsewhere. So they kind of compensate the absence in the global economy by using political influence. For instance, Western Balkans is one of the areas where they are really a strong player at the moment, and this has created some gray hairs for us Europeans.
I think for the U.S., the Russian economy isn't a factor. It's unfortunate that it isn't a factor, but it isn't a factor. The issue in the U.S., of course, is Russian meddling. Russia is viewed very negatively by the public, and that's because of its demonstrated interference in the U.S. election process. As COVID makes Russia weaker, those meddling efforts, I believe, will actually intensify. Of course, now you have China in the act and Iran. So those three are viewed as extremely dangerous with respect to the election process in the US, and therefore with respect in part to the future of the country. Certainly Russia, as China, want to see Trump win again. That's because the longer Trump is in office, the weaker the United States gets. And to the extent they can effect that, that is still a foreign policy priority for both countries, but most especially given how well documented it is for Russia.
Right. Our next question comes from Miko Hotori from the always excellent Merix in Berlin. So with the US treating China as a strategic competitor, if not a downright enemy, can the EU treat China as a partner, competitor, and rival at the same time with equal weight? And if so, is this a sufficient strategic framework in regards to China?
That's a good question, because we published a year ago a China paper in, when I say we, I mean the European Commission. And there we identified China as a strategic or systemic rival. And this characteristic means that as our political systems are different, it has consequences in various areas, for instance, in economy. And that's why we see China as a rival. But it was not as negative as the English word rival might mean, because it was just a honest reflection that due to the fact that our systems are so different, it creates rivalry, and not always on the level playing field. But at the same time, we have expressed very clearly that we want stronger partnership between the EU and China. And that's why we have, for instance, tried to get this comprehensive trade agreement or comprehensive investment agreement done without results so far. So I think it's possible to combine partnership, the role of competitor and rival at the same time, without saying that China is also a rival. It would not complete honest characterization of our relationship. So that's why the three words you put to your question, I think, can be combined, and I think it's the right way to look at our relationship between the EU and China.
It was a perfect reaction. There is only one sentence on my side, which I would like to add. A minute ago, we spoke the issue whether decoupling would be the best way, how to deal with China. I believe that instead of decoupling, we need to bring China to shoulder its part of responsibility for global issues, including environment. And this is why we need, on one side, to resist, because we all know that China is struggling for global dominance and hegemony. But on the other side, or at the same time, we need to talk to them. We need to bring them to share their part of responsibility for major global issues.
Yeah, I agree with that. Look, I think I have not heard any country, my own included, that actually has a strategic framework for dealing with China. We understand that on issues of global import, we have to cooperate, climate change being the perfect example. Pandemic should have been the example. It's astonishing that the pandemic brought out the worst of what's in China and frankly, the worst of what's in the United States. Shouldn't have worked that way, but that's what happened. So certainly cooperation is important. Certainly the US and China, Europe and China are rivals, certainly competitors, ferocious competitors. So we can identify elements that we know are, but I think that there has been, to my mind, nothing that I've seen coming out of any of these countries or groups that really speaks to the vision that we have for China that's realistic, or that speaks to how we see the world develop. What will it look like, let's say, in a decade or a decade and a half? And if we have a vision on what we want it to look like, which is not entirely clear to me either, then how do we get there? And I think one of the reasons this is a very hard exercise is because you have a systemic rival, if you will, as Europe says, a country whose precepts are now clearly at odds with Western values, nonetheless integrated with the West in ways that are non-reciprocal, to be sure, but nonetheless integrated. And this makes the exercise extremely complicated. And that leads me to a final point, which is once you start calling a country an enemy, this is entirely self-fulfilling. The relationship with China is, for every country, a complicated mix. It's a complicated stew. And using one label to describe that relationship is, first of all, intellectually dishonest, but second of all, very dangerous, because the label most typically ascribed these days is quite negative. And that's a mistake. It leads to sloppy thinking. It leads to a lack of creativity and ultimately conflict. So I and many other people who've worked with many think tanks over the years and who continue to do so and work in track 2 dialogues and all of the rest, I believe haven't really hit on either a formula or the expression of that formula in a way that satisfactorily captures either the nature of this relationship from a strategic point of view, or what the world ought to look like, not pie in the sky, but what it ought to look like in 10 or 15 years.
Great. So we going right off of what we just discussed with the CAI, the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment. We actually have several questions asking about that. So I think a good way to summarize them is, what percentage chance would you give it that it is completed by the end of 2020, as was the objective? And if not in 2020, when, if ever?
Well, if I may start, what I have heard about the latest EU-China discussions is that China obviously is committed to these discussions, but the movement is very slow, if any. So it may sound a bit tricky that they are at the same time committed, but nothing moves. But there, in the political negotiations, there can also be a situation where there is not commitment and nothing moves. So now there is a commitment, but nothing moves. So it's slightly better. But EU has done its offer, market access offer, and Chinese response has been that we have to meet in halfway. And from our perspective, there's no halfway, because we are completely open and you are not. So our offer does not expect to open everything in one go, but there is no halfway. Basically, this kind of situation doesn't exist. So half a year ago, 4 months ago, we tend to think that we managed to get this deal done by September, when the German is holding the presidency and there is a summit between China and the EU. But now I would say that the percentage of get the deal done by September is close to 25 or 20. By 2021, I would raise it to 40.
If I may join Jyrki, it is for the second time when I have to express my pessimism rather than optimism, because politically speaking, the wind is blowing in bad direction. We face headwinds in these days politically. I am sure that you are well familiarized with the situation when the EU diplomats face a censorship in Beijing when they try to publish a letter. You know very well that our diplomats, either in Paris or in the Czech Republic, they face growing assertiveness or aggressiveness of Chinese diplomats. And this is dangerous. And you know very well that, for instance, Joseph Borrell was drilled in the European Parliament, being accused that the EU is bowing to China. It is very serious. So this is a growing acknowledgement that we have to stand up against these tendencies. So this political climate is not very friendly for such kind of business as the free trade agreement or trade agreement with China. So we have to be patient in this sense and to think about our own resilience in the first row, and in combination of resilience and patient dialogue with Beijing, maybe the day will come a little bit later when both sides will be ready for compromise.
And perhaps just to jump to the American side with the phase one trade deal. So for Ambassador Barshefsky, do you think we will ever see a phase two under President Trump, including under a second administration or a second term? And what would the trade war look like under a Biden administration?
I think Biden will remain tough on China because he should be tough on China, right? It's an unbalanced relationship in so many ways, and China, as a muscle flexor, is menacing, of course, the South and East China Seas, menacing Hong Kong, as we know, Taiwan, of course, and in general, not particularly acting positively in the international arena. Belt and Road is another area of concern for many reasons, including geostrategic. And I think for Biden, who's quite realistic and, as you all know, has been around the block more than once, will take a realistic posture toward China. But I don't think it'll be a posture whose chief characteristic will be vitriol and insult. That's not the way Biden operates, and it certainly isn't the way you get anything done. Phase two, certainly nothing now. And let's see, will it ever? Well, my view is that China's technology policies in particular are set. China believes they are successful for China. China is indifferent or growingly indifferent about how it affects other important countries. So if there's a phase two, the agreement will either be a weak agreement, or if anything more than a weak agreement, will never be implemented by China. So if China had to give Trump in a second term some victory, might it do something and call it a phase two? Maybe. If Trump wanted, would he settle for it? Yeah, if politically he didn't need any more juice out of it, he'd settle for it. China knows that. And would it be meaningful? No.
We are nearly close to ending, and let's end maybe on an optimistic vote. So maybe my friend Jens Esklund from Maersk, our vice president for the Chamber, has been throwing this question. So Jacob.
Yeah, so we've heard the word optimism several times tonight. Is there anything that you can see in the present situation that gives you hope that China and the EU and US will find a way to resolve their differences? Uh-oh.
Could I make two suggestions? Resolve differences? Probably not. But the three together act in a positive way. I can think of two things. One, the three entities should now come up with a plan for vaccine manufacture and distribution before any of the countries know who wins in the vaccine race. This would be extremely positive. It will be necessary. And the only way the three, I think, can interact comfortably is to do that now, so that regardless, whether it's China or EU companies or US companies, whoever comes up with it, or some other country, whoever comes up with a vaccine, the mechanisms will be in place for rapid manufacture and rapid deployment, which is what the outcome should be. So that's one. I think the second area, which I think presents a very interesting opportunity, of course, Director General Aceveda is stepping down early. Many were taken by surprise at this. It would be terrific if certainly the US and Europe could come up with a candidate, or if the US, Europe, and China could agree to a candidate, or perhaps a limited slate of candidates who would be acceptable to any of them. That would be a positive thing, because it might also spark a little bit of life into multilateralism, which is, as we know, has been on life support for quite some time now in the WTO. So I would just suggest those two things as ways to think about more positive outcomes from the current triumvirate.
If I may continue, the reason of, or the source of my optimism lies in an understanding that it is very difficult to influence processes in the US or in China. Maybe not difficult, but impossible. But what is possible is to influence processes in Europe. And especially thanks to last couple of weeks, I feel growing optimism, because just yesterday, Ursula von der Leyen has introduced very ambitious plan dealing with economic recovery after Corona crisis. It seems to me that we are united, maybe not completely. I believe also that other countries not willing to grant money to the others will join this effort to create a huge fund of 750 billion euros, but via which many useful projects should be financed. And it is also a politically very strong signal. My optimism comes from understanding that there is huge space in Europe for further improvement. I don't want to go back and to repeat everything which has already been said, but there is huge space when it comes to technology, soft power, industrial policy, but also when it comes to hard power, when it comes to our ability to respond to regional and to participate in global challenges. And this is fantastic. If I have a feeling that Europe has the future, we are courageous enough, we are strong enough to be a reliable partner of the United States. If it is happening, I believe that we will enjoy bigger or higher respect in Washington. And then at the end of the day, together with US, we will enjoy much higher respect and positive echo also coming from Beijing as well.
I very much agree with my colleagues here, and Charlene's point, the last point, to try to find a joint list of candidates or one candidate for the section of WTO was very, very tangible and interesting. It could be a new start for the multilateralism. But my suggestions are economic related. First of all, we thought that we are in the middle of economic crisis when the US-China trade war appeared. But now we are in even deeper. So there is a necessity to reboot the economy, and I believe that global audience or all the governments are in a position where they think that there's only global solution. So this could bring us together more than what has happened during the last few years. The second point is that climate policy may get more boost now, because everybody recognizes that this crisis is ahead of us anyway, and now once using public resources for stimulating the economy, it's better to use it the way which also addresses the climate change, and this creates a new market for circular economy products and technologies and solutions, but also to digital services.
Yes, ladies and gentlemen, we have passed the hour already, and I have to unfortunately conclude. Let me thank you very much for the members attending, but also let me, of course, thank Charlene Barshefsky, because it sounded like a job application for WTO from your side. You know.
No. That's for sure. No.
Jurki is well qualified.
I was going to get there. Well, American with Eastern European roots who got China into WTO. May you live with this. So that was my idea. And Jörg, of course, you have gone through the negotiations. You know how tedious decision making is. You experienced this yourself in Europe. You would be qualified. And I think Mikuláš would be equally a very good candidate because he got Slovakia into the European Union and into NATO, and I'm sure he would get China into the WTO as well as the United States. So let me all thank you very much. You have been fun, enlightening, inspiring, and I wish you all a good morning, a nice afternoon, and for the members here, a good evening, and we will repeat this series possibly again in October. Take care.
Thanks for listening to our webinar Playback series. We hope you enjoyed the content and that you're eager to listen to the rest of the episodes. Thanks as well to our guests, Chamber President Joerg Wuttke, and my colleagues Zhang Yichi and Gao Rui for handling the editing and content on the back end. This has been Jacob Gunter at China Dispatches, the official podcast of the European Union Chamber of Commerce in China. Thanks for listening.